Welcome to West Film. We bring you the best movie recaps, reviews, ending explained videos, and hidden details from your favorite films. If you love great movies, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now grab some popcorn, and let's jump into today's movie. They bring Jin to Rebel Alliance headquarters on Yavin 4, where she's questioned by Mendelsohn and the other rebel leaders. They explain that an Imperial pilot has defected and claims to be carrying a message from Galen Erso. Since Saw Gerrera has cut ties with the Alliance and trusts almost no one, Mendelsohn asks Jin to help Kassan make contact with him. In exchange, the rebels promise to help locate and rescue her father. Jin agrees, though she remains wary of their motives. Unknown to her, Kassan has received a separate, far more ruthless order. If Galen is found, Kassan is to assassinate him rather than bring him back alive. Jin, Kassan, and K2SO travel to Jeddah, where the Empire is stripping kyber crystals from the ancient holy city to power the Death Star's main weapon. Meanwhile, Saw and his partisan fighters have been carrying out violent attacks against the Imperial occupation. Shortly after entering the city, Jin and Kassan get caught in the middle of a fierce battle between the partisans and Imperial forces. They're nearly overwhelmed until a blind spiritual warrior named Chirrut Asmu and his heavily armed companion, Baze Malbus, step in to help. Despite the assist, the whole group is captured by Saw's fighters and taken to his hidden base. Jin is finally reunited with the man who raised her after her mother's death. Saw has also imprisoned Body Rook, suspecting the pilot may have been sent by the Empire as part of a trap. Saw shows Jin the holographic message her father recorded. In it, Galen explains that although he was forced to finish the Death Star, he secretly built a fatal weakness into its design. A precisely placed attack on the station's reactor system could trigger a chain reaction and destroy the whole weapon. To find the exact location of that vulnerability, the rebels need to steal the Death Star's technical schematics from an Imperial data archive on the planet Scarif. While Jin is watching the recording, the Death Star arrives above Jeddah. Krennic orders a low-power test of the super weapon against the moon's capital city. The blast unleashes a wave of destruction that begins tearing across the surface. Jin and the others escape Saw's base with Body, racing back to their ship as the city collapses behind them. Saw, worn down by years of war and unwilling to keep running, chooses to stay behind in the base and dies as Jeddah is consumed. After the successful weapons test, Grand Moff Tarkin congratulates Krennic but immediately starts taking control of the Death Star project. Using Body's defection and the security failure around Galen's message as proof that Krennic can no longer be trusted to manage the station. Body then leads Jin's group to the Imperial Research Facility on Eadu, where Galen and the other Death Star engineers are stationed. Kassan takes up a sniper position overlooking the facility, ready to carry out his secret assassination order A. But when Galen steps outside, Kassan can't bring himself to pull the trigger. Jin makes her way onto the platform and reveals herself to her father. Before they can properly reunite, Rebel Alliance bombers attack the installation. Unaware that Jin and Kassan are still inside, the airstrike devastates the facility and leaves Galen critically wounded. Jin reaches him moments before he dies. Galen recognizes his daughter and dies in her arms, leaving Jin devastated. Kassan arrives and helps her escape with the others aboard a stolen Imperial cargo shuttle. Following the attack on Eadu, Krennic is summoned to Darth Vader's fortress. He tries to secure Vader's support and asks for an audience with the Emperor, hoping to reclaim authority over the Death Star. Vader is unimpressed by his ambition and warns him against any further security failures. Back on Yavin 4, Jin appears before the Alliance Council and lays out a plan to attack Scarif and steal the Death Star schematics. She explains that her father deliberately built in a weakness and insists the station can be destroyed. Most of the council refuses to act, arguing that an assault on the Empire would be suicidal, as some even start considering surrender now that the Death Star exists. Frustrated by their fear and hesitation, Jin decides to go ahead without official approval. Casson, now a believer in her story, gathers a small group of rebel soldiers who volunteer to join the mission. Chirrut, Baze, Body, and K2SO stand with her too. The team boards the stolen Imperial shuttle and heads for Scarif. When Imperial Flight Control asks for their call sign, Body quickly names the ship Rogue One. After slipping through the planetary shield, they land near the Imperial base. Jin and Casson disguise themselves as Imperial officers and enter the archive complex with K2SO. Outside, the remaining rebels launch an attack on the garrison with explosives and blaster fire, making it look like a much larger invasion force has arrived. The Rebel Alliance eventually learns about the unauthorized assault after intercepting Imperial communications, and realizing Jin's team is already fighting on Scarif. The Rebel fleet deploys to support them. Inside the archive, K2SO seals the doors and holds off Imperial soldiers while Jin and Casson search for the Death Star files. The droid fights until he's overwhelmed and destroyed, sacrificing himself so the mission can continue. Meanwhile, Chirrut crosses an exposed battlefield under heavy fire to reach the master control switch needed to establish communication with the rebel fleet. He activates it successfully but is killed by an explosion moments later. Baze, enraged by the death of his closest friend, charges into the Imperial forces and takes down several soldiers before he's killed too. Body manages to contact the rebel fleet and warns them that the planetary shield has to be disabled before the Death Star plans can be transmitted. Just after delivering the message, an Imperial grenade lands inside the shuttle and kills him. Above Scarif, the rebel fleet attacks the Imperial ships guarding the shield gate. Using a damaged Star Destroyer as a weapon, they cause two Imperial vessels to collide and crash into the gate, taking down the shield barrier. Jin and Casson finally locate the Death Star schematics, but Krennic confronts them at the top of the transmission tower. During the struggle, Casson is injured and falls to a lower platform. Krennic corners Jin, but before he can kill her, Casson returns and shoots him. With the shield gone, Jin uploads the schematics and transmits them to the Rebel command ship in orbit. The Death Star soon arrives above Scarif. Tarkin orders another low-powered strike, this time targeting the compromised Imperial base. Krennic looks up from the tower and sees the weapon he helped create firing directly at him. The blast destroys the installation and sends a massive wave of fire across the planet. Knowing there's no escape, Jin and Casson sit together on the beach as the destruction approaches. They embrace before the shockwave reaches them, killing them along with everyone else still on the surface. In orbit, the rebel fleet prepares to jump to hyperspace with the stolen plans. But Darth Vader's flagship suddenly arrives and intercepts several of their ships. Vader personally boards the rebel command vessel and cuts through the soldiers guarding the data, desperate to recover the schematics. The rebels manage to pass the plans from one soldier to another until they're carried through the closing airlock. A smaller ship detaches from the command vessel and escapes with the files safely aboard. On the fleeing ship, an officer hands the Death Star plans to Princess Leia. Asked what they've received, Leia looks at the schematics and answers with a single word. Rogue One arrived at a strange point for Star Wars. The prequel trilogy was still being argued over. The Force Awakens had brought the franchise roaring back, and Disney was clearly testing how far this universe could stretch beyond the numbered episodes. So this film had a slightly awkward job. It needed to feel familiar without becoming another remake, and it had to justify telling a story when everyone already knew where it was heading. That's probably why calling it a standalone film has always felt a little misleading to me. Technically, yes, you can watch Rogue One without sitting through every other Star Wars movie. The central mission is simple enough: steal the Death Star plans and get them into rebel hands. But the film is tied so closely to A New Hope that it almost feels like an extended opening chapter rather than a fully separate adventure. Its final moments don't just reference the original film, they run straight into it. And honestly, that closeness could have been a problem. A movie built around one sentence from the opening crawl of a film released in 1977 sounds like the kind of idea cooked up in a boardroom. Someone points at a tiny piece of mythology and says, "There's 2 hours of content in that." Somehow, Rogue One turns that little gap in the timeline into something worth exploring. It gives faces, personalities, and consequences to a victory that had previously existed as background information. What helps is that it doesn't circle back to the Skywalker family. There's no chosen one at the center, no young Jedi discovering some enormous destiny, no attempt to create another Luke. These are mostly ordinary people, soldiers, spies, deserters, and damaged survivors who happen to be standing between the Empire and total control. That gives the film a different texture from the main saga, and it makes the galaxy feel larger. For years, Star Wars sometimes gave the impression that every major event circled back to the same handful of people. Rogue One steps away from that, at least for most of its runtime, and shows that enormous historical victories can depend on people whose names will never become legendary. These characters matter because of what they do, not because of their bloodline. That's one of the strongest arguments for the anthology film idea. The Star Wars universe should be big enough to hold stories that don't need 10 sequels or another tied to the Skywalkers. Rogue One proves there's value in exploring the people operating in the background of events we already know. At the same time, the movie clearly understands that fans came in with expectations. It gives us familiar ships, uniforms, locations, and characters. Darth Vader appears. Tarkin is involved. The ending brings us directly to Leia. Some viewers will call that fan service, and to be fair, parts of it are, but most of the nostalgia feels connected to the period rather than randomly dropped in for applause. There's a visual consistency with the original trilogy that makes the movie feel like it belongs beside A New Hope. The technology looks older, heavier, more mechanical. The rebels don't have sleek, spotless headquarters. Everything feels used, scratched, slightly broken. Even though Rogue One was made decades later, it often feels more naturally connected to the 1977 film than the shinier prequels did. That places it in an interesting position within the franchise. It's not as culturally important as the original trilogy. That's almost an impossible standard. A New Hope changed blockbuster filmmaking, and The Empire Strikes Back became the film every darker sequel has been compared to since. Rogue One isn't doing that kind of work. It's operating inside a world those films already created. But compared with episodes I through 3, it feels far more controlled. The performances are more natural, the world feels lived in again, and the danger has real weight. Even people who enjoyed the prequels can probably admit that Rogue One handles its war politics and visual atmosphere with more confidence. The Force Awakens is a trickier comparison. That film has more warmth, humor, and immediately lovable characters. It's built to recreate the feeling of classic Star Wars, and at times recreates it a little too closely. Rogue One is less playful and far less interested in giving the audience a comfortable adventure. It wants to be rougher, sadder, more grounded. Depending on what you want from Star Wars, that makes it either more rewarding or less enjoyable. Some viewers will miss the sense of wonder and lightness. Others will appreciate that Rogue One doesn't simply repeat the rhythm of A New Hope while pretending to be something new. It borrows the visual language of the original trilogy, but the tone is closer to a military film about a doomed operation. For newcomers, the movie mostly works, though I wouldn't call it the perfect introduction to Star Wars. The mission is easy enough to follow, but the opening throws out a lot of names, planets, and political information very quickly. Someone with no prior knowledge of the Empire, the Rebellion, or the Death Star may follow the basic plot while missing why certain moments are supposed to matter. For longtime fans, it's the opposite. The timeline, the cameos, and the design choices add another layer, particularly in the film's final stretch. Watching Rogue One right before A New Hope can genuinely change how the older film feels. The stolen plans no longer seem like a convenient object that simply kicks off the plot. They carry the weight of everyone who died getting them there. That makes the whole release order versus chronological order debate more interesting. Watching A New Hope first preserves the mystery and simplicity of the original introduction. Watching Rogue One first adds emotional context and makes the opening chase feel like the continuation of a much larger battle. Neither approach is wrong, but they create very different experiences. The film has also shifted slightly with time, especially after Cassian wasn't the character everyone connected with when Rogue One first came out. For many viewers, he was just one member of a crowded team. After spending more time with him, and with the machinery of the rebellion, in Andor, returning to this movie gives his decisions more weight. The same goes for Sojourner and the fractured political world around the Alliance. That extra context doesn't fix every weakness in Rogue One, but it strengthens its place in the franchise. What once looked like an isolated experiment now feels like part of a more detailed corner of Star Wars. One interested in surveillance, occupation, radicalization, compromise, and the slow construction of resistance. And that may be Rogue One's real legacy. It showed that Star Wars could survive without following the usual formula. It could tell a complete story. It could end without preserving everyone for a sequel. It could focus on characters outside the central family and still feel essential to the larger saga. Whether it's one of the greatest Star Wars films is a matter of personal taste. Some fans see it as the best thing Disney has done with the franchise, others find it emotionally distant and carried mainly by a spectacular final act. I land somewhere between those reactions. It's not the original trilogy, and it doesn't need to be. It's also not just filler between episodes. Rogue One takes a piece of information we already knew and makes us feel the cost behind it. In a franchise that keeps returning to familiar faces and familiar conflicts, that was a genuinely valuable change. The basic idea behind Rogue One is almost ridiculously simple. A small group of rebels has to steal the Death Star plans before the Empire can fully weaponize it. That's it, and no complicated prophecy, no hidden royal bloodline, no giant mystery box waiting to be opened in the next movie. The entire film is built around one mission, and because we already know those plans eventually reach Princess Leia, the suspense can't really come from wondering whether the larger objective succeeds. The film has to make us care about how it happens, and that's where the story gets more interesting than it first appears. What used to be a single sentence in A New Hope's opening crawl is turned into a desperate operation involving spies, defectors, scientists, extremists, and soldiers who aren't entirely convinced victory is possible. Rogue One takes a tiny piece of established history and tries to give it human weight. At the center of it all is Galen Erso, the scientist forced by the Empire to help complete the Death Star. He can't stop the project outright, so he does the only thing still available to him. He builds a weakness into the weapon and sends word to the rebellion. That detail matters because it answers one of the oldest jokes about Star Wars. Why would the Empire build a planet-sized battle station with one incredibly convenient flaw? Rogue One turns that weakness from a writing shortcut into an act of sabotage. It doesn't completely erase the convenience of the original idea, but it gives it intention, and more importantly, sacrifice. Jyn is pulled into the mission because of her connection to Galen, not because she's eager to become a hero. She's spent most of her life avoiding causes, armies, and promises. The Rebel Alliance offers her freedom in exchange for helping them reach her father, and at first that's more transaction than calling. Cassian, meanwhile, is already deeply committed to the cause. He isn't stepping into the conflict for the first time, he's been shaped by it. That gives the early mission an uncomfortable tension, Since Jin is looking for her father while Kasan is carrying orders she doesn't fully understand. There's a stronger story hidden in that setup, a daughter hoping to reconnect with a man she barely knows, a soldier ordered to kill that same man, a rebellion desperate enough to use both of them. Rogue One touches all of this, though it doesn't always slow down enough to let the tension breathe. The opening section is where the film struggles most. It moves rapidly between Jin's childhood, Galen's forced return to Imperial service, Kasan gathering intelligence, Body's defection, Saw's fighters, rebel leadership, and several different planets. None of these scenes is pointless, but they arrive so quickly that the first act can feel like someone shuffling through a stack of briefing documents. New names appear, new locations appear, and characters get introduced for a minute before the film jumps somewhere else. For viewers already comfortable with Star Wars politics, the broad picture is manageable. The Empire has built a weapon, the rebellion needs proof, and Galen may have left a way to destroy it. For newcomers, though, the beginning can be harder to settle into as the movie assumes a certain level of familiarity with the galaxy even while telling a supposedly standalone story. The central plot itself isn't actually complicated, the presentation just sometimes makes it feel that way. Once Jin, Kasan, and K2SO are traveling together, the movie becomes clearer. They need to find Saw. Saw has access to Galen's message. That message reveals the weakness. Then the rebels have to reach the Imperial Archive on Scarif and transmit the plans. That progression gives the second half much stronger direction. Every location has a specific purpose, and the story stops feeling like a collection of introductions. It becomes a mission movie. There are still conveniences along the way. Characters arrive at exactly the right moment. Information survives just long enough to push the plot forward. Plans change, doors open, transmissions connect, and ships appear with the kind of timing blockbuster screenplays often depend on. Some of that's easy to forgive because the movie keeps moving. Other moments feel a bit too arranged, especially when so many separate actions have to happen perfectly for the final transmission to succeed. The Rebel Alliance's response to Galen's message is one of the more interesting choices. After spending so much time trying to confirm the Death Star's existence, the leadership refuses to support an attack on Scarif. The risk is too high, the evidence incomplete, the alliance politically divided. That refusal is where the title comes from. Jin, Kasan, and a small group of volunteers take a stolen ship and leave without official approval. They're not following a grand military strategy, they're forcing the rebellion to act by creating a situation it can no longer ignore. This is where Rogue One starts to feel less like a traditional heroic adventure and more like a messy wartime operation. The mission isn't authorized. The plan is barely a plan. Everyone is improvising, and each success creates another problem. That structure works especially well because the audience knows the plans must eventually escape Scarif, just not what it will cost. The question slowly shifts from will they get the plans to how many people will be left by the time they do. There's also something refreshing about the film not setting up endless sequels. It doesn't introduce mysteries purely to keep fans speculating, and it doesn't pause to advertise another character's future adventures. The story has a beginning, a mission, and an ending, giving it a sense of purpose many franchise films lack. At the same time, calling Rogue One completely self-contained is still a stretch. The whole film exists to connect with A New Hope, and the ending doesn't just point toward that movie, it attaches itself directly to its opening moments. The final handoff of the plans, Vader's arrival, and the glimpse of Leia turn Rogue One into the immediate first chapter of the original film. For some viewers, that's thrilling. For others, it makes the movie feel less independent than Disney's standalone label suggests. Personally, I think the direct connection is both a strength and a limitation. It gives the ending enormous momentum because we know exactly what comes next. The victory feels fragile, and there's no time for celebration. The plans move from one set of hands to another while the Empire is almost close enough to take them back. But that connection also means Rogue One can never fully escape its function. It's filling a gap, a very well produced, emotionally serious gap, but still a gap inside another story. The absence of the usual opening crawl seems designed to signal that difference. There's no grand introduction floating through space, no immediate John Williams blast, no episode number. The movie wants us to understand this isn't another chapter in the Skywalker saga. It's a bold choice, even if it feels strange at first. Star Wars has such a fixed opening rhythm that removing it creates a brief sense that something's missing. Then the story begins, and the film has to build its own identity without leaning on the traditional ceremony. Rogue One's narrative isn't flawless. The first act is crowded, the exposition uneven, and some plot mechanics are clearly visible. Certain emotional turns happen too quickly, and several supporting characters get only enough development to keep the mission moving. Still, the film understands the value of a clean objective: steal the plans, send them to the fleet, give the rebellion a chance. Everything eventually narrows toward this goal, and once it does, Rogue One becomes much more confident. The story stops explaining the war and starts showing people trying to survive it. That's why the simple premise works. The outcome may already be written, but the people inside it are not. The film takes a piece of Star Wars history that once felt almost administrative and turns it into a story about choices, mistakes, desperation, and the kind of victory that doesn't feel victorious until much later. Rogue One has a lot of characters, maybe too many, honestly. That's both one of its strengths and one of the reasons the film can feel emotionally uneven. The group looks great together. Everyone brings a different history, personality, and reason for being there. But the movie moves so quickly that some of them never become more than a strong introduction and a memorable final moment. Jyn Erso is supposed to be the emotional center of it all, and on paper, she has more than enough material. As a child, she watches her family fall apart. Her mother is killed, her father is taken by the Empire, and she's left hiding alone until Saw finds her. That's a brutal beginning, and it explains why the adult Jyn wants nothing to do with political causes. She's already been used, abandoned, and pulled into other people's wars. By the time we meet her again, she's not waiting for a chance to join the rebellion. She's in Imperial custody, having survived by keeping her head down and trusting almost nobody. That makes her early attitude believable. Jyn isn't cold because the screenplay wants a fashionably tough heroine. She's defensive because every authority figure in her life has failed her in some way. The Empire took her father, Sauri's then abandoned her, and now the Rebel Alliance frees her from prison only because she's useful to them. Even the people offering her a shot at freedom are treating her like a tool. Felicity Jones handles that guarded quality well. She doesn't play Jyn as constantly angry or openly broken. Most of the pain sits beneath the surface. There's a stiffness to her, a reluctance to show enthusiasm for anything, as if caring too much is just another way to get hurt. The problem is that the film sometimes asks her to change faster than the emotional groundwork allows. Jyn moves from detached survivor to passionate believer in the rebellion within a fairly compressed stretch of the story. Her father's message is obviously the turning point, and it's a powerful one. For the first time, she understands that Galen didn't simply abandon her and choose the Empire. He was trapped, and he spent years quietly preparing a way to fight back. That revelation reconnects her personal loss with the larger conflict. Her motivation is no longer just finding her father, it's finishing what he started. The scenes between Jyn and Galen are among the most emotionally direct moments in the film. Even though they're brief, Mads Mikkelsen gives Galen a tired, haunted quality, a man who's lived with guilt for years and knows he may never be forgiven. When he finally sees Jyn again, the reunion is almost immediately taken from them. The film doesn't give them a long conversation or a clean resolution. Galen dies before either of them can really repair what was lost. That should be the point where Jin fully takes control of the movie, and in some ways it is. Her speech to the rebel leadership, her decision to go to Scarif, and her willingness to lead the mission all show how far she's moved from the prisoner we met earlier. Yet she's also surrounded by characters who are often more immediately distinctive. Casananda is probably the clearest example. Diego Luna plays him as a man who's spent so long serving the rebellion that he no longer knows who he'd be without it. He isn't a cheerful hero, he's tired, practical, and capable of doing things the film's traditional good guys might avoid. We see that almost immediately when he kills an informant rather than risk capture. That moment tells us a lot about Casan. He believes in the cause, but belief hasn't made him pure, it's made him useful. He follows orders because he's convinced himself every compromise is necessary. And the movie leaves enough discomfort around that idea to keep him interesting. His relationship with Jin works because they start from opposite positions. Jin distrusts causes because they've destroyed her life. Casan has sacrificed so much for one cause that questioning it would mean questioning everything he's done. They're not written as a traditional romantic pairing, which helps say there may be a trace of attraction or emotional connection between them. But the film never stops to force a love story into a mission where it doesn't belong. Their bond develops through shared danger and a gradual recognition that both are carrying different versions of the same damage. Casan also changes in a quieter way. He's ordered to kill Galen and doesn't do it. Later, when Jin decides to go to Scarif without permission, Casan joins her and brings other volunteers with him. He's still fighting for the rebellion, but for once he's making the choice himself instead of hiding behind orders. Body has a simpler arc, though it's one of the most important. He's an Imperial pilot who defects after Galen convinces him to carry a message to Saw. Riz Ahmed gives Body nervous, almost fragile energy. He doesn't look or behave like someone naturally suited to rebellion. He looks terrified most of the time, which makes sense, since he's betrayed the most powerful military force in the galaxy. Body's courage isn't the absence of fear, it's continuing while visibly overwhelmed by it. His role also brings redemption into the group dynamic. He served the Empire, even if he was never one of its ideological believers, and by helping expose the Death Star, he tries to undo some small part of the machine he once supported. Chirrut and Baze arrive with a completely different energy. Chirrut is one of the few characters in the film who still speaks openly about the Force. He's not a Jedi, and the movie never pretends otherwise, but his faith gives him a calm the others don't have. Donnie Yen plays him with warmth, humor, and confidence. He can be funny without becoming a joke, and spiritual without sounding like he wandered in from a different movie. He's also one of the film's most naturally charismatic characters. Baze is quieter and more cynical. He carries the heavy weaponry, watches Chirrut's back, and seems less certain that Faith has any place left in the galaxy. Their friendship suggests a much longer history than the film has time to explain. Now you understand their relationship through behavior rather than exposition. Chirrut believes Baze complains. Baze still follows him everywhere. That's enough. Their presence also keeps the idea of the Force alive without turning Rogue One into a Jedi story. Chirrut treats it as faith, instinct, and connection rather than a superpower. Baze treats it like something he may have stopped believing in but can't completely abandon, because it's tied to the person he loves most. Then there's K2SO, who very nearly steals the entire film. Alan Tudyk gives the reprogrammed Imperial droid exactly the personality this story needs. K2SO is blunt, sarcastic, and completely uninterested in pretending the odds are better than they are. He provides comic relief, but the comedy comes from character rather than random jokes. He says what everyone else is thinking, usually at the least appropriate moment. What makes him work is that he never feels disconnected from the danger. His humor doesn't weaken the stakes, it often reinforces them, since he's constantly calculating just how unlikely survival is. K2SO also develops a surprisingly effective bond with Jin. He begins by treating her as a security problem and ends by sacrificing himself to protect the mission. The film doesn't overplay the moment, which is probably why it lands. Sojuru is much more frustrating. Forrest Whitaker brings enormous intensity to the role. Saw is physically damaged, paranoid, and clearly shaped by years of fighting the Empire through methods even the Rebel Alliance considers too extreme. He represents the ugly side of resistance at the point where survival, revenge, and ideology become difficult to separate. There's so much potential there. Saw raised Jin. He abandoned her. He's broken away from the Alliance. His fighters are willing to use tactics that make other rebels uncomfortable. He's suspicious of everyone, including the pilot carrying Galen's message. Any one of those threads could have supported a much larger storyline. Instead, Saw mostly exists to connect Jin with a hologram and then disappear from the film. His refusal to escape Jeddah is presented as a final surrender from a man exhausted by war, but because we've spent so little time with him, the moment feels more abrupt than tragic. Whitaker makes him memorable. The script doesn't quite make him necessary. Orson Krennic is another character who benefits heavily from performance. Ben Mendelsohn plays him with ambition, irritation, and a constant need for recognition. Krennic isn't a calm, untouchable villain. He's a middle manager inside an evil empire, desperate for credit for the weapon he's spent years developing. That insecurity makes him entertaining. He's surrounded by people more powerful than he is, including Tarkin and Vader, and much of his anger comes from knowing they can take his achievement away from him. Krennic wants to be feared, but he also wants approval. Mendelsohn captures the slightly pathetic side of that ambition without making the character harmless. The wider ensemble is impressively international. Diego Luna, Donnie Yen, Jiang Wen, Riz Ahmed, Mads Mikkelsen, Felicity Jones, Forrest Whitaker, and Alan Tudyk all bring noticeably different rhythms to the film. The rebellion feels less like one culture and more like a collection of people from different parts of the galaxy who happen to share an enemy. That diversity fits the story. An empire should create resistance everywhere. Still, the cast doesn't always gel as strongly as it could. There are so many introductions and so little quiet time that relationships often feel implied rather than developed. Jin and Cassian get the most attention, while everyone else is given a few defining traits before the final mission begins. For some viewers, that's enough. Other characters are easy to root for because the goal is clear and the odds are terrible. For others, the emotional distance is the film's biggest weakness. The ending asks us to mourn people we've only known through fragments. I think both reactions are fair. The ensemble works better as a unit than as a collection of fully explored individuals. They're not a group of colorful heroes spending multiple films together. They're strangers and damaged allies brought into the same operation because each one can contribute something essential. That makes the film less intimate, but it also fits the war story approach. Jin may be the lead, but Rogue One isn't really about one person becoming a legend. It's about several people whose separate lives briefly align around the same objective. Some are believers, some are exhausted, some want redemption, some are just trying to finish what somebody else started. None of them expects to become famous. They just need the plans to leave Scarif. That's why the ensemble remains effective even when the character development is incomplete. The movie doesn't make every rebel unforgettable, but it gives the group a collective identity. By the final act, they feel less like a team assembled for a franchise and more like people who understand that this mission is probably the last thing they'll ever do. And once they accept that, the lack of a future becomes part of who they are. What separates Rogue One from most Star Wars films isn't the timeline, the cameos, or even the absence of Jedi leading the story. It's the mood. This is a film about people who already look tired before the main battle even begins. The uniforms are dirty, the equipment is worn down, the bases feel temporary, and almost everyone carries the expression of someone who's been fighting for too long. There's very little of the bright, adventurous feeling the franchise usually reaches for. Rogue One is more interested in exhaustion and desperation. The title says Star Wars, but this is one of the few entries that really leans into the war part. The characters aren't moving through the galaxy on a grand adventure. They're conducting missions, gathering intelligence, following orders, losing people, and making decisions with incomplete information. Nobody has much time to process anything. That shift gives the movie a heavier atmosphere. The Empire isn't simply a collection of villains standing in clean control rooms. Its power is felt in occupied streets, destroyed cities, prison transports, and frightened civilians. The Death Star is still a giant science fiction weapon, but Rogue One tries to show what that kind of power looks like from the ground. It's not just a planet disappearing in the distance. We spend time in Jeddah before the weapon is fired. We see the market, the crowds, the Imperial patrols, and the tension between local fighters and occupying troops. So when destruction comes, it feels less abstract. The place had a life before the Empire erased it. That grounded perspective makes the Death Star more frightening than it had been in earlier films. The weapon isn't just huge, it's immediate. People can see the blast coming and still have no way to escape it. The same feeling carries into the rebellion. In the original trilogy, the rebels are clearly the heroes. Rogue One doesn't reverse that, but it does make the organization less comfortable to admire. These people are fighting tyranny, yet the film acknowledges that resistance has pushed some of them into morally ugly territory. Cassian is introduced meeting an informant who's terrified of being captured when escape becomes impossible. Cassian kills him and leaves. It's a quick scene, but it changes how we see the Alliance. The rebels aren't all smiling pilots waiting for a heroic briefing. Some are spies who've spent years lying, assassinating, and sacrificing people to keep the movement alive. Cassian later admits that many of them have done things they're not proud of. If they stop now, they'd have to face the possibility that all of it was for nothing. That's a darker motivation than simple heroism. They're fighting because the cause matters, but also because they've already given too much to walk away. Cassian's orders regarding Galen make that conflict even clearer. The Alliance wants information about the Death Star, yet it's prepared to eliminate the man who created its weakness before fully understanding what he's done. From a military perspective, the order makes sense. From Jin's perspective, it's just another group using her father and deciding whether he deserves to live. Rogue One doesn't dig deeply into every consequence of this, but the tension is there. The rebellion is divided, cautious, and sometimes cowardly. Its leaders know what the Empire is becoming, but when Jin asks them to attack Scarif, most refuse. Some don't believe the evidence, others believe it but consider the mission too dangerous. It's easy to judge them because the audience already knows the Death Star must be stopped. Inside the story, though, they're being asked to commit their limited forces based on a desperate message and a plan that barely exists. That hesitation makes the Alliance feel political rather than purely heroic. Made up of factions, senators, soldiers, and leaders who don't always agree on how much risk is acceptable. Then there's Saw, who represents what happens when resistance breaks away from any larger structure. Saw is technically fighting the same enemy, but the Alliance wants distance from him. His methods are too extreme, his paranoia too deep. He's become the kind of rebel who sees betrayal everywhere and treats fear as proof of guilt. The film introduces a fascinating question through him: when does resistance become extremism? Unfortunately, it doesn't spend enough time answering it. Saw has his own fighters, his own territory, his own war against the Empire. He isn't interested in diplomacy or approval from rebel leadership. And he's been fighting so long the struggle seems to have consumed everything else in him, which could have opened the door to a much more complicated political story. Rogue One hints at divisions inside the rebellion but usually moves on before those ideas can develop. Still, Saw matters, because he keeps the film from presenting resistance as one clean movement. Not everyone opposing the Empire agrees on methods, leadership, or what victory should look like. Even the main characters carry different relationships with the cause. Jin begins with almost no interest in the rebellion as she's heard its speeches before. Political language means very little to someone whose life has been shaped by abandonment and survival. When she says it doesn't matter which flag is flying if you don't look up, it sounds cynical. But it also sounds honest as she's survived by refusing to believe in larger ideas. Kassan is the opposite. He's believed for so long that the cause has become the only thing holding his choices together. Body is trying to escape the Empire and do something that might balance his past. Chirrut has faith in something larger than politics. Baze appears to have lost that faith but can't quite leave it behind. They're all moving toward the same mission for different reasons. That's where hope enters the story. Rogue One talks about hope often enough that it could have become empty franchise language. Sometimes it nearly does, but the film is at its best when hope isn't presented as optimism. These characters aren't optimistic. They know the mission is badly planned. They know the Alliance may not support them. They know the Empire has more ships, more soldiers, and a completed super weapon. By the time they reach Scarif, most of them probably understand they won't be coming back. Help in this film is acting when the odds give you no sensible reason to act. That idea is more convincing than simply telling the audience to believe. The characters don't expect rescue, they continue because success doesn't require their survival. It only requires the plans to escape. The shift away from Jedi strengthens that theme. There's no powerful hero waiting to arrive and turn the tide. Nobody can rely on a lightsaber, a prophecy, or some hidden ability. These are ordinary people facing an enemy that looks impossible to defeat. The Force still exists in the background, mostly through Chirrut, but it's treated differently. He speaks about it as faith rather than demonstrated power. Some characters believe, others don't. And the film never turns that disagreement into a lecture. Chirrut's faith gives him courage, but it doesn't protect him from the cost of war, and that matters. Rogue One lets belief inspire people without becoming an escape from consequence. Chirrut can trust the Force and still die. Baze can doubt and still be changed by watching him. The Force becomes less about controlling events and more about how people find the strength to move through them. There's also a real sense that the good guys might lose. Obviously, anyone familiar with A New Hope knows the plans will survive. But inside individual scenes, Rogue One creates uncertainty because victory keeps shrinking. The rebels aren't trying to destroy the Empire, they're trying to transmit a file. Then they're trying to keep a door open. Then they're trying to reach a switch. The scale of the goal keeps narrowing while the cost keeps rising. That's what gives the sacrifices meaning. One by one, the characters complete a small part of the mission and are removed from it. K2 so holds off soldiers long enough for Jin and Kassan to continue. Body establishes the connection. Chirrut reaches the control switch. Baze stays behind and fights. Nobody wins alone. The mission succeeds because each person contributes something and accepts that somebody else will finish the next step. It's almost the opposite of the usual chosen one structure. There's no single heroic action that saves everyone. The victory belongs to the group, including people who never even meet one another. That's what makes the ending painful without feeling completely hopeless. Jin and Kassan don't escape Scarif. They sit together and watch the destruction approach, knowing the plans have been transmitted. There's no last-minute rescue. The film understands that saving the rebellion and saving the characters aren't the same thing. That choice gives Rogue One emotional weight. But it also explains why some viewers find it less enjoyable than other Star Wars films. There's less humor, less wonder, far less room for uncomplicated adventure. The Force Awakens, for example, is much warmer. It gives the audience characters who connect immediately, jokes that break the tension, and the excitement of rediscovering the galaxy. Rogue One is colder. It asks us to spend time with people who are guarded, morally compromised, and already half consumed by war. For some viewers, that seriousness makes the film richer. For others, it strips away the color that made Star Wars special in the first place. Both reactions make sense. Rogue One sometimes confuses bleakness with depth, and not every character is developed enough for the tragedy to land as hard as intended. The film wants to be a political war story and a huge franchise spectacle at the same time, and those two sides don't always blend perfectly. But the darker approach isn't just surface styling, it supports the central idea that rebellions are built through loss. The clean victory celebrated at the end of A New Hope begins here, with frightened people making uncertain decisions and dying without knowing how history will remember them. Most of them won't be remembered at all. That may be the most interesting thing Rogue One adds to Star Wars. The saga usually focuses on the names that become legends. This film looks at the people underneath those legends are the ones who carry the message, open the gate, transmit the plans, and hold the hallway for a few more seconds. They don't defeat the Empire. They make defeat possible. And in this story, that's what help really means. Rogue One is a strange film structurally, because the part that works best is also the part that makes everything before it look weaker. The final act is so focused, so urgent, and so emotionally clear that the first half can feel like it belongs to a different movie. Not a bad movie, necessarily, just a busier, more fragmented one still trying to figure out where its attention should be. The opening is the main problem. There's a childhood prologue, a prison break, an intelligence mission, an imperial defector, a rebel extremist, a secret message, several planets, and a large cast of characters, all arriving within a fairly short stretch. The film isn't difficult because the central story is complicated. It's difficult because the information comes in pieces, each scene lasting just long enough to introduce something before moving on. You barely settle into one location before another name appears on screen. That creates momentum but not always clarity. The screenplay seems afraid to stay in one place too long, perhaps because it knows how much setup has to be completed before the actual mission begins. Introduce Jin, establish Cassian, explain body, bring in Saw, reveal Galen's message, show the Death Star, get everyone moving toward the next objective. The efficiency is obvious. The rhythm isn't always natural. In the first 40 minutes or so, there are moments where the film feels less like a story unfolding and more like a collection of necessary pieces being placed on a board. The pieces matter, but you can feel the screenplay arranging them. That's probably why some viewers found the film confusing, even though the plot itself is quite simple. The Empire has built the Death Star, Galen created a weakness, the rebels need proof, then they need the plans. None of that is especially complicated. But the early editing gives each piece of information its own short scene, often on a new planet with new people. The film keeps asking the audience to reset. Once the group is together, things improve. Jin, Cassian, and K2 so give the story a more stable center. When they arrive on Jeddah, the movie starts to feel less like exposition and more like an actual journey. There's a location to explore, a goal to pursue, and tension between the characters that can finally develop inside the same sequence. The story still moves quickly, but the movement feels more purposeful. That difference becomes even clearer after Galen's message. Until that point, Jin is being pushed from one situation to another. Afterward, she has a reason to act. The mission becomes personal, and the film gains direction along with her. The screenplay deserves credit for trusting the audience more than some large franchise movies do. It doesn't stop every few minutes to explain what each character is feeling. It lets information come through behavior, glances, and incomplete conversations. Kassan's guilt isn't delivered in a speech when we first meet him, we understand it through what he does. Jin's distrust isn't explained every time she refuses to cooperate, it's visible in how she responds to people. Baze's attachment to Chirrut is never over-described, their history comes through in familiarity. That kind of writing gives the film some maturity. At the same time, there's a difference between restraint and underdevelopment, and Rogue One occasionally crosses that line. Several characters are interesting in concept but thin in practice. Body is a defecting pilot trying to redeem himself. Chirrut is a spiritual believer in a world where the Jedi have vanished. Baze is a former believer carrying more cynicism than faith. Saw is a revolutionary who's become too extreme for the official rebellion. Those are strong ideas, but the film often gives each character one or two defining qualities and then moves on. Because of that, the audience may understand what they represent without feeling especially close to them. That becomes important later, because Rogue One is clearly building toward tragedy, and the final act depends on the emotional effect of watching these people fall one by one. For some viewers it works completely, for others, the losses feel more admirable than heartbreaking. You respect the sacrifice even if you don't always feel you knew the person making it. Jin and Galen come closest to giving the film a personal emotional core. Their relationship is built through absence. Jin has spent most of her life believing her father left her. Galen has spent those same years trapped inside the Imperial machine, quietly trying to create one chance for resistance. When Jin finally sees his recorded message, the film slows down just enough to let Felicity Jones react. Her guarded expression begins to break. The father she resented was still thinking about her. He hadn't forgotten her, he hadn't simply chosen the Empire. It's one of the few scenes where the movie lets emotion arrive before action interrupts it. Their reunion on Eadu should be the emotional peak of the relationship, but it happens quickly. Galen is injured, Jin reaches him, and they exchange only a few words before he dies. The brevity is painful, and perhaps intentionally so. They don't get the conversation either of them needed. Still, part of me wishes the film had given them slightly more room. Mads Mikkelsen and Felicity Jones are both capable of carrying quieter material, and the story might have benefited from letting their relationship breathe before ending it. That's a recurring issue throughout Rogue One. The emotional ideas are good, but the film is often in too much of a hurry to explore them. Jin's transformation is another example. She begins as someone who refuses to care about the rebellion. Not long after hearing Galen's message and losing him, she's standing before the Alliance, arguing passionately about hope. The change makes sense in theory. Her father's sacrifice gives her something to finish. The Death Star becomes real, and the rebellion becomes the only force capable of stopping it. But the transition feels compressed. A few more scenes of Jin wrestling with what Galen asked of her might have made the speech feel less like a required heroic turning point and more like the natural result of an internal change. The screenplay is stronger when it lets contradictions stay unresolved. Kassan isn't transformed into a clean hero. He's done terrible things for the Alliance and still believes in the cause. He refuses to kill Galen, but that doesn't erase the fact that he was prepared to do it. Saw is fighting the Empire, yet his methods have made him frightening even to potential allies. The rebel leadership wants to stop the Death Star, yet fear and disagreement prevent it from acting. These tensions give the story texture. Rogue One isn't simply saying the rebels are good and the Empire is bad. Although that larger moral division is obviously still there, it's interested in what people become while fighting something much worse than themselves. The problem is that the film introduces more moral complexity than it has time to examine. Saw is the clearest missed opportunity. His existence suggests a fractured resistance movement with different ideologies, methods, and visions of liberation. The screenplay could have used him to explore how far rebellion can go before it starts resembling the violence it opposes. Instead, he becomes a dramatic checkpoint in the plot. The same is true of the Alliance Council scene. It shows fear, division, and political hesitation, but the film quickly moves past those ideas. Once Jin decides to act, you can feel a more complex political film underneath Rogue One. It appears in brief flashes. Then the demands of the action story take over. That action story is very effective, though. Once the team reaches Scarif, the pacing locks in almost completely. The film no longer has to introduce anyone or explain the mission, it can simply follow the operation as it breaks apart. Jin and Cassian enter the archive. K2SO guards the entrance. Body tries to establish communication. Chirrut and Baze help activate the signal. Rebel pilots attack in space. The Imperial response closes in from every direction. The editing moves between these threads with increasing speed, but unlike the opening, the geography and objectives are clear. We know what everyone is trying to do. That clarity is what makes the finale exciting rather than exhausting. Each action affects another part of the mission. The ground team can't transmit without the fleet. The fleet can't receive without the shield being opened. Jin can't reach the plans without K2SO buying time. The story finally becomes a chain of cause and effect rather than a chain of introductions. This is also where the film's emotional restraint starts paying off. K2SO's death works because it's practically he isn't given a long final speech. He holds the door and keeps firing until he can't. Body's death is sudden, almost cruelly so. He completes the connection and barely has time to realize he succeeded. Chirrut crosses open ground while repeating the words that have carried him through the film. Baze watches, then keeps fighting with a different relationship to that faith than he had before. The deaths aren't identical, each one completes something that gives the tragedy structure. The film doesn't merely kill off the cast to appear bold, their sacrifices are tied directly to the mission. Every loss moves the plans closer to escape. By the time Jin and Cassian reach the beach, the movie has stripped away almost everything except the fact that they succeeded. Their final scene is quiet. No speech about destiny, no kiss forced into the moment, no miraculous rescue over the horizon. They sit together. That simplicity is one of the strongest choices in the film. Jin and Cassian have spent most of the story running, arguing, and surviving. At the end, there's nothing left to do. The plans are gone. The mission is complete. The Death Star's light reaches them anyway. For some viewers, this is where Rogue One becomes genuinely moving. The film finally slows down and lets the cost settle. For others, the scene may not land as deeply, because Jin and Cassian's relationship was never developed enough. They became allies, then trusted each other, but much of that connection formed during action rather than conversation. Again, the emotional idea is stronger than the amount of time given to it. Then the film keeps going. The transfer of the plans and Darth Vader's attack create an entirely different kind of ending. The beach scene closes the emotional story. The corridor sequence reconnects the film to franchise mythology. It's thrilling, frightening, and almost impossible to forget. It also risks overshadowing everything that came before it. Many people leave Rogue One talking about Vader rather than Jin, Cassian, or the sacrifice on Scarif. That's understandable, since the sequence is expertly built and gives Vader a level of physical menace rarely seen in the films. But there's something slightly ironic about a movie devoted to unknown rebels ending with one of the most famous characters in cinema taking over the screen. The finally moment pushes the connection even further. For longtime fans, it can be emotional. Other plans have survived, hope has physically passed from one generation of rebels to the next, and A New Hope is now only seconds away. For others, the digital recreation is distracting enough to break the feeling. The moment also became more emotionally complicated after Carrie Fisher's death. Seeing a young Leia receive the plans can carry a sadness that was never intended when the scene was created. That context exists outside the film, but it's hard to separate from the image. The screenplay's biggest success is probably that it makes a known ending feel uncertain in the moment. We know the plans reach the rebellion. We know the Death Star will eventually be destroyed. We know Leia survives this immediate encounter. Rogue One can't change any of that. What it can do is show how close the entire effort came to failing. The tension comes from process rather than outcome. A cable has to connect, a signal has to transmit, a ship has to escape, one hallway has to stay open for a few more seconds. The film turns established history into immediate danger, and that's not easy. Its biggest weakness is that the narrative rushes through the characters needed to make that danger emotionally devastating. The film has enough heart, but sometimes not enough time, enough ideas, but not always enough space between them. Still, the final result works because the story becomes more confident as it goes. The first act is setup, the middle is commitment, the ending is consequence. Rogue One may not be perfectly balanced, but it knows where it wants to leave the audience, not with the excitement of a clean victory, but with the strange feeling of watching people win something they'll never live to see. That's why the ending stays with you. The action is spectacular, Vader is unforgettable, and the connection to A New Hope is satisfying, but underneath all of that is a much quieter idea. History remembers that the plans were stolen. Rogue One asks us to remember who carried them. Rogue One doesn't really become the movie people remember until the mission reaches Scarif. Before that, there are good action scenes, the ambush on Jeddah has energy, the attack on Ida looks impressive, and the film keeps moving often enough that it rarely feels flat, but those sequences still feel like pieces of a larger setup. Scarif is where everything finally clicks. The location alone helps. Star Wars battles usually happen in deserts, forests, snowfields, or deep space. Scarif looks almost peaceful at first, bright water, white sand, palm trees, blue skies. It has the look of a holiday destination, which makes the Imperial base sitting in the middle of it feel even stranger. Then the shooting starts, and that contrast gives the finale a visual identity of its own. The battle isn't hidden under darkness or smoke from the start. We can see the soldiers clearly, see the scale of the beach, the open ground, the Imperial machinery moving through it. There's nowhere for the rebels to disappear. The mission itself is barely organized. Jyn, Cassian, and the others arrive without official approval, using a stolen Imperial ship and a name body invents on the spot. There's no polished briefing where every stage has been carefully planned. Beyond knowing the plans are somewhere inside the archive, much of the operation depends on getting through one obstacle and figuring out the next problem afterward. That gives the action a messy, improvised quality. The rebels aren't executing a brilliant strategy, they're creating enough confusion for Jyn and Cassian to get inside. Explosions go off across the base, soldiers split into smaller teams, and the situation grows faster than anyone can control. It feels less like a traditional heroic assault and more like people trying to keep a collapsing plan alive. This is where Rogue One's war film influence becomes most obvious. The ground battle has confusion, poor communication, and sudden losses. Characters don't always know what's happening outside their immediate area, and orders change because the situation has already shifted by the time the message arrives. There's a real sense that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. The film also does a good job making each part of the action feel necessary. The battle is huge, but the objective stays surprisingly small. Jyn and Cassian need to find one file, Body needs to contact the rebel fleet, Chirrut needs to reach a control switch, the Space Forces need to break the shield gate. Those goals are clear, and that clarity keeps the finale from becoming random noise. Even when the film cuts between the beach, the archive tower, and the battle above the planet, we understand what each group is trying to accomplish. That sounds simple, but plenty of large action films lose control at exactly this point, piling on explosions until the audience no longer knows what matters. Rogue One keeps narrowing the mission instead. The spectacle gets bigger, but the characters' problems get more specific. K2SO is trapped outside the archive while Imperial soldiers close in. Jin and Kassan are climbing through a massive data structure looking for the correct plans. Body has the message ready but can't send it. The fleet arrives, yet the planetary shield blocks the transmission. Every solution reveals another obstacle. That rhythm makes the final act feel urgent without needing constant explanation. The movie doesn't stop for long speeches because nobody has time for one. People shout information, make quick decisions, and move. The ground combat has a physical quality that helps too. Blaster fire kicks up sand. Soldiers are thrown by explosions. Heavy Imperial walkers move through the tropical landscape like machines that don't belong there. The rebels look tiny next to them, and the film never pretends the sides are evenly matched. The Empire has the base, the troops, the armor, the ships, and the shield, while the rebels have surprise and a few minutes. That imbalance makes their success feel less inevitable, even though we already know the plans eventually escape. The film is very good at making us understand just how many things had to go right for that to happen. The arrival of the rebel fleet is one of the finale's most satisfying moments, because it changes the scale of the mission. What began as a small unauthorized raid suddenly becomes a full battle. The X-Wings dive toward the surface, Imperial fighters launch in response, capital ships exchange fire above the planet. The battle expands in seconds but still feels connected to the people on the ground. The space action is some of the strongest in the franchise. There's a real weight to the ships. They don't move like weightless digital objects. The larger vessels feel enormous, and the smaller fighters look vulnerable weaving between them. The sequence involving the disabled Star Destroyer is especially memorable. A rebel ship pushes one Imperial vessel into another, and both crash into the shield gate. It's a spectacular image, but it also serves the story. The destruction opens the route needed for the plans to reach the fleet. That's the key difference between effective spectacle and empty spectacle. The scene looks impressive, and the audience understands why it matters. The action is strongest when it keeps that connection between scale and purpose. The X-Wing attacks are exciting because they protect the ground team. The fleet battle matters because it opens the transmission path. The archive fight matters because Jin is carrying the one piece of information the Empire needs recovered. The entire assault exists to support that recovery. Nothing feels completely separate. Even the smaller deaths are built around action rather than detached emotional scenes. K2SO's final stand is a perfect example. He seals Jin and Kassan inside, then turns to face the approaching soldiers. The humor disappears, but the character doesn't suddenly become sentimental. He fights the same way he's spoken throughout the film, directly, efficiently, without pretending the situation is better than it is. His sacrifice hurts because it's practical. He buys time. Body's death works in a similar way. He finally gets the connection established and sends the message. Then the ship is destroyed almost immediately. There's no dramatic pause to celebrate. The mission keeps moving without him. Chirrut's walk toward the control switch is more openly emotional. He crosses exposed ground while repeating his belief in the Force, surrounded by blaster fire that somehow keeps missing him until the task is done. The scene could have felt overly staged, but Donnie Yen gives it enough calm to make it work. Chirrut isn't charging like an action hero, he's walking because he's accepted what he needs to do. Then he reaches the switch, and the film doesn't reward him with survival. Baze's reaction carries the rest of the emotion. He's spent much of the story sounding more skeptical than Chirrut, but after losing him, he repeats the same words and returns to the fight. It's a small character payoff inside a very large battle. The archive sequence is quieter but just as effective. Jin and Kassan climb through towering rows of data cartridges, searching for the file Galen named. The design of the room makes the information itself feel physical. These aren't files sitting on a convenient screen. They're stored in huge mechanical structures that have to be searched and retrieved by hand. That older technology connects the film visually to A New Hope, but it also gives the scene tension. Jin has to climb. Kassan has to operate the mechanism. Krennic arrives before they can leave. The confrontation with Krennic isn't the most complex fight in the film, but it has personal weight. He's the man who took Galen, destroyed Jin's childhood, and helped turn the Death Star into reality. Their conflict has been building beneath the larger mission. Still, the film doesn't make Krennic the final obstacle in a conventional way. He's defeated, but he doesn't control the true ending as the Death Star does. That's fitting. Krennic spends the entire movie trying to claim ownership of the weapon, and in the end it destroys him along with everyone else on Scarif. He looks up at the thing he helped create and realizes, too late, that he was never important to it. The final moments on the beach are almost peaceful compared with everything before them. Jin and Kassan have transmitted the plans. The tower is collapsing. The fighting is finished for them. They reach the shore and sit together as the blast spreads across the horizon. There's no escape route, and the film doesn't pretend there might be one. That decision gives the climax more weight than a last-minute rescue would have as the mission succeeds. But the characters don't get to enjoy the victory. They can only know they completed their part. The image of the blast moving over the water is beautiful and terrible at the same time. Rogue One repeatedly shows destruction with an almost painterly sense of scale, which can feel uncomfortable because the imagery is so attractive. But the film usually keeps the human cost in view. On Scarif, we know who's still down there. The destruction isn't just a visual effect, it's the end of the entire group we've followed. The film could have stopped there emotionally, that is the ending. Instead, it adds one more sequence. The plans move through rebel hands while Darth Vader attacks the escaping soldiers. This scene has almost nothing to do with the emotional tone of the beach. It's pure terror and momentum. And it works. Vader is presented less like a theatrical villain and more like a force of violence. The lightsaber appears in darkness, and suddenly the corridor becomes a trap. The rebel soldiers aren't fighting him, they're trying to survive long enough to pass the plans through the door. That tiny objective keeps the scene connected to the rest of the finale. The film has spent its entire final act showing people completing one small task before someone else takes over. The hallway continues that pattern. One soldier passes the plans to another, then another. The mission survives because the information keeps moving. It doesn't stop the story, it surrounds it. The film also borrows the spirit of the original trilogy without completely copying its tone. There's still humor, strange creatures, heroic pilots, and impossible machinery, but Rogue One is heavier. It feels like a story that could exist in the same universe while looking at it from a different angle. That distinction matters, because The Force Awakens had already leaned heavily on the emotional rhythm of A New Hope. For many viewers, that was comforting. For others, it felt like a polished remake disguised as a sequel. Rogue One takes a different route. It uses familiar visual material but places it inside a mission film with the mood of a war drama. The nostalgia is in the surroundings. The narrative energy comes from somewhere else, which makes the film feel both old and new. Gareth Edwards deserves a lot of credit for that balance. He has a strong instinct for scale, and Rogue One gives him a universe built around enormous objects: the Death Star, Star Destroyers, Imperial Walkers, Rebel fleets, planetary cities. Edwards doesn't just show these things, he usually places people beside them. A Star Destroyer is impressive on its own, it becomes threatening when it hangs above a tiny settlement. A walker looks cool in a wide shot, it feels dangerous when soldiers are running beneath its legs. That sense of proportion gives the movie much of its visual power. Edwards repeatedly reminds us the characters are small inside this conflict, not unimportant, just small. That difference matters. The Empire has machines large enough to erase cities, but the film's entire outcome depends on individuals passing information from one person to another. Edwards uses scale to make the rebels look vulnerable, then uses action to show that vulnerability doesn't make them powerless. His direction is especially effective during the major battle sequences. The Scarif climax is huge but remains understandable. There are fights on the beach, inside the archive, above the planet, and around the shield gate. A weaker director might have turned all of that into noise. Edwards keeps returning to clear objectives. They open the gate, send the signal, retrieve the file, protect the entrance. The spectacle never completely loses its narrative purpose. He's also good at building atmosphere before the action begins. Jeddah feels tense before the fighting breaks out. Eridu feels dangerous because of the weather and terrain. Scarif looks exposed long before the rebels are surrounded. The environments do more than provide different backdrops. They affect the emotional temperature of the scenes. There's a seriousness to Edwards's direction that fits the material, though sometimes it pushes the film close to being self-consciously grim. Rogue One occasionally seems very aware that it's the darker, tougher Star Wars movie. Characters stare into the distance, rain falls, military machinery fills the frame, the lighting turns low and dramatic. Most of this works because the story genuinely involves sacrifice and occupation. Still, there are moments when the film seems determined to prove it's more mature than the other entries, which can make parts of it feel slightly heavy. The humor keeps the mood from becoming completely oppressive. AK-2 is essential here, and his sarcasm gives the movie breathing room without undermining the danger. The stormtroopers also get a few smaller comic moments, usually through ordinary conversation that makes them feel less like identical targets. The comedy isn't constant, and that's probably why it works. Edwards lets funny moments exist inside the world instead of turning every tense scene into a setup for a joke. That restraint helps the movie hold on to its identity. The musical score faces a similar challenge. Michael Giacchino was stepping into a franchise defined by John Williams, and that's not a normal composing job. Williams's themes aren't just background music, they're part of the cultural identity of Star Wars. The opening notes alone can trigger an emotional response before a scene even begins. Rogue One makes the unusual choice to drop the traditional opening crawl and the familiar main title theme. The first time you watch it, that absence is noticeable, maybe more noticeable than the film expects. There's something almost unsettling about seeing the words "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away" and not immediately hearing the music your brain has already braced for. Instead, Rogue One begins in a quieter, more restrained way. The decision signals that this isn't a numbered episode. It wants to separate the anthology story from the main saga. Conceptually, that makes sense. Emotionally, it takes some adjustment. Giacchino's score has to build a new identity while still sounding like it belongs in Star Wars. That's a very narrow path. Imitate Williams too closely and the music feels like a copy drift too far, and the film risks losing part of the franchise's musical character. He lands somewhere in the middle. The score is atmospheric, urgent, and often effective during the action, supporting the war film mood with heavier rhythms and more anxious energy. There are moments of wonder, but the music is generally less playful than the classic scores, which fits Rogue One. This isn't a film about discovering the galaxy, it's about surviving long enough to complete a mission. The score is especially strong during the final act, pushing the Scarif battle forward without flattening every scene into constant noise. It knows when to build, when to pull back, and when to let the images carry the emotion. The final moments on the beach are a good example. The music doesn't try to turn Jin and Cassan's deaths into a loud heroic victory. There's sadness, relief, and a sense of completion. The mission succeeded, the people didn't survive it. Giacchino understands that difference. Still, the score isn't as memorable as Williams's best work. That's not exactly a criticism, more an almost impossible comparison. Williams created themes people can recognize after only a few notes, while Rogue One's music is effective while the film is playing but doesn't stay in the mind with the same force afterward. Some viewers felt the original themes should have been used more heavily. Brief musical phrases appear at key moments, and familiar ideas surface when the story connects directly to older characters or events. The end credits finally bring back more of the classic sound, satisfying for fans, but also a reminder of what was held back throughout. since every time a familiar melody begins, part of the audience waits for it to continue and then the score moves away again. Personally, I think leaning on the older music too much would have weakened the film's attempt to establish its own tone. The movie already contains a large amount of visual nostalgia. If the soundtrack had constantly repeated Williams, Rogue One might have felt even more dependent on the original trilogy. At the same time, it's hard not to miss those themes. They carry decades of emotional weight. And Giacchino was working with limited time to create a replacement score. Considering that pressure, the result is impressive. It supports the film, sounds connected to Star Wars, and avoids becoming a simple copy. That's probably the most realistic success anyone could have expected. Darth Vader's appearances bring together the film's nostalgia, direction, and music in the most obvious way. Vader isn't used constantly. He appears just enough to remind us that Krennic is operating beneath much more powerful figures inside the Empire. His first major scene has an almost theatrical quality. The dark setting, the controlled voice, the physical dominance are all familiar. James Earl Jones immediately restores the character's presence. The scene also gives us one of the film's stranger jokes, which feels slightly out of place depending on your tolerance for Vader making a threat through wordplay. Then the ending completely changes how he's used. The corridor sequence doesn't treat Vader as a reference, it treats him as a threat, which is why it works so much better than a simple cameo. The film finally shows what it would feel like for ordinary soldiers to encounter him in a confined space. There's no duel, no balanced fight, no chance. The red lightsaber appears, and the scene becomes almost horror. Edwards directs the sequence with remarkable control. The darkness, the sound, the narrow hallway, and the rebels' panic all build Vader's power without requiring a long display. He's on screen for a very short time. The effect is enormous. The scene is also a perfect example of fan service done well. Fans obviously want to see Vader. The film gives them that, but it also uses his appearance to keep the story moving. The rebels are trying to pass the plans through the door. Vader is trying to stop them. The sequence isn't paused so the audience can admire him as the mission is still happening. That's the difference between a nostalgic appearance and a functional one. Tarkin is more complicated. His role makes sense. He's directly connected to the Death Star and to Krennic's struggle for recognition. Bringing him into the story strengthens the link to A New Hope and gives the Imperial side an internal conflict. Krennic built the project. Tarkin intends to take control of it. Their scenes reveal the Empire as a place of ambition, competition, and political cruelty, where nobody is loyal to anyone beyond usefulness. The issue is the digital recreation. No matter how important Tarkin is to the story, some viewers spend his scenes studying the face rather than listening to the dialogue. The effect becomes part of the performance, and once the illusion slips, it's hard to stop noticing. That's where nostalgia starts working against the film. The desire to recreate Peter Cushing exactly may have been stronger than the need to preserve immersion. A different actor, presented without the digital face, or a more limited use of Tarkin, might have caused less distraction, but it also would have weakened the visual continuity with A New Hope. The filmmakers chose recognition. The result remains impressive and uncomfortable at the same time. Leia's appearance creates the same debate in a much shorter moment. From a storytelling perspective, she's the final destination of the plans. Her presence completes the bridge into A New Hope. From an emotional perspective, the moment is designed to release all the tension of Scarif. The plans survived, the rebellion has a chance. One word completes the idea: hope. It's very direct, maybe too direct. The digital face can pull viewers out of the scene, and some understandably feel that showing Leia from behind would have been enough. The audience knows who she is, and the full reveal isn't necessary to communicate the connection. But the film wants the emotional recognition to be immediate. It doesn't want ambiguity. That choice has become even more emotionally loaded because of Carrie Fisher's death. What was originally meant as a triumphant connection now carries an unavoidable sadness. The film couldn't have predicted that, but it changes how the scene feels. The cameos and references are likely to divide viewers based on how much affection they already have for Star Wars. A longtime fan may enjoy seeing familiar rebel pilots, hearing old musical phrases, and recognizing vehicles from the original films. A casual viewer may understand the plot but feel that certain moments are aimed at an audience with more background knowledge. That doesn't make Rogue One inaccessible. The mission is clear enough to work on its own, but the film definitely rewards recognition. The final battle means more when you know what those plans will allow Luke Skywalker to do. Vader's pursuit means more when you know how A New Hope begins. Leia's appearance means more when you understand what she represents. This creates an interesting contradiction. Rogue One is one of the best arguments for Star Wars stories outside the main saga, yet it's also deeply dependent on the audience's relationship with the main saga. It proves the universe can expand, then connects almost every major emotional payoff back to something familiar. Maybe that's unavoidable for the first anthology film Disney needed to show that a standalone Star Wars story could succeed, but it probably didn't want to move too far from the safest period in the timeline. So the movie explores new characters while surrounding them with recognizable mythology. The approach worked commercially and creatively well enough to suggest countless other possibilities: stories about soldiers, spies, ordinary citizens, different factions of the rebellion, people living under imperial occupation. Rogue One makes the galaxy feel larger precisely because its heroes aren't central to the famous family drama. And yet, by the end, the Skywalker story is waiting right outside the door. That's the film in miniature.